great conference. I think there were 400 attendees. Tyrone, who used to work for me, is on this call, and I just asked him on Slack chat if he wants to chime in. Feel free. He also made a slide he doesn't want to. So, first of all, there's the EU Cybersecurity Act, not to be confused with the EU Cyber Resilience Act, actually went into effect several years ago. I'm going to guess 2019. If I get years and stuff like that wrong, feel free to correct me in the chat or chime in. And that was the one that created eventually the EUCC. And it was also supposed to create other schemes like one for cloud, one for 5G. I don't know if it was supposed to be one for AI, but the only one that actually got created was EUCC. That was supposed to be the easy one. And I guess it took, 5 years? And they're still in the pilot phase. So, yeah, that bit is really focused on a very sort of small subset compared to what the Cyber Resilience Act is looking at. The CRA, in my mind, is a on-prem procurement law. The way I would put it to you guys is this way. In the US, we don't have penalties or rules around selling products. We just have procurement, what I would say are instructions and guidance, which you have to follow in order. For example, if you want to sell to the US government, they would really like to, and you have a product that it fits into their categories, they would like to see that your product is evaluated under the CC. But it's not just US government. It really is not US government. It's certain agencies of the US government, like DOD. And I think it still says on CNSSP 11, IA and IA enabled, but I'd have to double check that. Again, people can correct me in the chat if I got that wrong. In Europe, what they're doing is something very different. They're not leaving it up to individual agencies and countries to say, you can't buy from this company if they don't have a cert. Instead, what they're saying is, if you want to sell in this marketplace, this market space, then you must have what they call a declaration of conformity. Now, I think there's actually templates out there already about this. I didn't actually look at them. There's actually companies now who are saying that we can help you to get a declaration of conformity. But think of a declaration of conformity as sort of a certificate, but a lot more detail. And what type of a declaration of conformity you might need is defined by the type of technology you sell. So if you have a declaration of conformity, I'm going to talk about dates in a second, then you're allowed to sell in the EU with the declaration of conformity, which is sort of like, I solemnly swear, unless of course it's done by a third party. If you want to sell in the European market and you're a product, oh, by the way, what is this related to? Anything that has a digital element. What is a digital element, you may ask? Well, and one presenter even said it could be an alarm clock. Now, that sounds ridiculous because what alarm clock company is going to go through this procedure? Probably none. But they actually used at the conference children's toys as an example. There's a lot of IoT that sort of drove this, I think, originally. But the scope just kept getting expanded and expanding. So you want to sell in Europe, you don't have a declaration of conformity, your product is available for sale in Europe, and it's after a particular date, which I'll say in a second, then Europe will hit you with penalties, kind of like GDPR, except much worse. I believe, and again, I'm just as working from this red notebook, I think it's 2.8% of worldwide revenue is the penalty you could face should you try to sell a product with a digital element in Europe without a declaration of conformity. So let's just let that sink in for a second. What they're doing is setting up in my mind, hey, it could be my personal opinion. I don't work for Oracle anymore. A technical barrier to trade. I'd be fascinated to think what Doug Stroman would think about this. But the reality is that when CRE is fully in effect, if you have a product that is released after that date and you don't have a declaration of conformity, you could be subject to that penalty. Now, my understanding is that there will be people whose job it is to scour the marketplace, if you will, and look for violations. I don't know how that's going to work, but that seems to be a cool job to apply for if you're interested. So the big thing, the CRA that's associated with that penalty, that goes into effect sometime in December of 2027. There's an earlier date that's even more concerning that's a part of the CRA. Is one of the things that they've done, which goes into effect actually in September of this year, and I think it's September 11th, believe it or not, is around vulnerability reporting and incident reporting. But the way it's going to work is if you know about a vulnerability, an active vulnerability in the wild, you have a very short window to notify ENISA about this vulnerability. You're subject to penalties. Also, if you know about an incident, which is different than a vulnerability, with your product, you also have to notify in a very quick amount of time. There's a third element to this vulnerability part, which is insane and will affect companies like my former employer, which is this. If a product that fixes a vulnerability, a patch, you must make security patches available for free, even if they are not a customer. All right. That's going to break Oracle's licensing model, because Oracle's licensing model as a former employee, I believe, is you can download any product for free. If you want patches, you got to be a customer. All right. So when's this all go into effect? I mentioned September for the vulnerability bit. The second bit is around the full CRA. That's December of 2027. One of the keynoters said that what it drove all this is 38.5% of all attacks target the public administration, and 83.5% contain ransomware. And he's quoted something like, over the last year, there have been 42,595 vulnerabilities. So there you go. That's what drove all this. The next thing I'm going to talk about is what you got to do. I've mentioned the CSA. Before I forget, there is a new CSA coming, which is going to have supply chain security in it, PQC, and some new mandate for ENISA, but I don't remember what that is. So digital element that is connected to the internet. September 11th for incident reporting becomes mandatory. December 11th, CRA provisions become applicable. So one of the things that's pretty important about CRA at this point is that the law is done. If you're talking to your government relations, corporate affairs folks, and they'll be like, what can we do about this? That ship has sailed. This is a law now. The only thing we can do is figure out how we can respond to it. This was a good presentation by JTSC Plus around, which I think is important. And why is it important? Because this is going to determine the first task you're going to do if you're a vendor is you need to figure out what technology I have and how I am being subjected by this new regulation. And really, there's 4 things you got to worry about. The default category. The default category means it is considered by the powers that be the least security risk And they're fine with you doing a self-assessment and writing up a declaration of conformity without any third-party testing. So what does that include? Like if you're Apple, you're like, yay, mobile devices. If you're Google, email, yay. If you're Oracle, databases, terrific. If you're Slack, instant messaging tools, terrific. So you can see the black text on here. That is the least risky in their mind and only needs a declaration of conformity. This is a part of, by the way, your documentation that's going to be available for when you're downloading the product. Okay. On the other side, I'm going to jump to the red in a second, is what they consider the critical. These are the most important things to Europe. Shockingly, smart cards is number one, and HSMs, sorry, Thales. Basically, that's it. With critical, you're going to be doing high assurance CC evaluations because they're sort of using EUCC for that. Now, in the middle, that's the thing in my mind. So if I work my way backwards, class 2 is going to require third-party evaluations, but maybe you'll be able to use like a NIAP CPP plus horizontal standards. So what is a horizontal standard? There's vertical standards and horizontal standards in this thing. A horizontal standard goes across technologies. And an example that comes to mind is the vulnerability management requirements. So I mentioned earlier the requirements that are due for September. That is sort of documented in a horizontal standard, and somebody can put a link to what that is. And so regardless of what's in the CPP or the NIAP PP, you have to do a top up with a third-party lab to make sure they evaluate also your vulnerability management and processes and include that in your declaration of conformity, which will have to be done by a third party. Okay. Now, for the green ones, this is the one I understand the least, because I look at this, for example, and say operating systems. Oh, it's green, so can I just use the NIAP PP? Is that enough? They want third party, but are they going to need all of these horizontal standards? It's not clear to me. I don't know, but you're not in the black, you're not in nothing, and you're not just definitely the third party. It's a gray area to me. I didn't get a clear answer on what we were going to do. So so if I was still at Oracle, we working on a proposal for this. Our next step was going to be to map all of our products against these different types and categorize them. There was a great presentation by a guy from Nokia on the last day. Fabio Vignoli, Vignoli. I loved his presentation. And he created a CRA program management team, the Nokia EU CRA Program Governance Group. They just kicked off a program to classify their products. He also has this incredible timeline slide that essentially explains how it took them 2 years to get to the place they are now. And one of the big challenges he noted was the product vulnerability notification deadline and how they were going to address that.
One other wrinkle or complication to this categorization is the effect if you happen to be a vendor of open source material. It gets additionally more complicated as well as to how that is categorized.
Excellent point. Okay. So there's a support period that's associated with your declaration of conformity. I believe it's 5 years. if you do a non-substantial update to your product, and what does that mean? I don't know. Security patches seems to be okay. If you add a feature, maybe that would be a substantial update. I'd ask the question, if I go from OpenSSL 3 to OpenSSL 4, does that count as a non-substantial or substantial update? And I get different answers depending on who I talk to. If I went from TLS 1.2 to 1.3, is that a substantial update? Different answers depending on who I talk to. They don't really have a lot of the answers on some of this stuff. But I do know this. There was another presentation by E. Lawyer. Title of it was Product Liability Meets Cyber. Why the end of the CRA quote unquote support period is not liability end. And that is because the end of the CRA support period, which is 5 years for that product that you've got a declaration of support of conformity, is not the end of risk, because the way they have this whole logic that's laid out in her presentation about how vendors and customers will be able to sue vendors who sell in the EU after the 5-year support period, in which they still list their product as a declaration of conformity and it's still available for sale, but there aren't valid security patches available for it. So you're going to need to pull your product, I believe, if you're not going to provide security patches anymore. Question from Runman. Go ahead.
Hey, John, it's Ruman. Ruman from Broadcom.
Hi.
I have one question about this families. If one product has different services like virtualization and routing and switches, would it be considered as class 1 or class 2? Is it product-based or service-based?
That's a great question, because we asked about that kind of stuff. Nobody knows. We think that they probably require it to be the higher level.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, virtualization is included with Oracle Linux and Oracle Solaris, and you have to have it. So, we would be subject to class 2 or class 1. We don't know. It's so crazy, but we'd probably be treated as class 2. Probably be better from a risk-based approach to approach it with during the class 2, because you're going to get less chance to get dinged.
Yeah, but
worth.
should I restrict the class 2 requirements to only the virtualization part or the whole product? Well, on the router side.
Excellent question. Target of evaluation. This is a common criteria. This is one of the biggest problems. They don't believe in the toe. That's a CC thing. That's another reason why you have to do a top up, because your evaluation in common criteria is a target of evaluation. The CRA requires the whole product that you sell to be evaluated.
Okay. Got it.
So that's the top up, right? Because target of evaluation is a primary sort of part of the common criteria. And even when we go to ST evaluations. So you're going to be looking at, let's say, for example, you're a access control product and you have a GUI and you have a command line interface, and it both says the same thing. In the old days, you might only evaluate the CLI because you're like, the GUI has some issues. It's way more complicated to test, and you would be able to just fly through your CC evaluation. Not anymore. You're gonna have to do your GUI as well.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's still some discussion around that. So there's still some dispute about what you really need to cover, if you can exclude something or not. That stuff still under discussion. But given the timelines that are out there, that's interesting that we have so many uncertainties at this point.
They haven't even released. There's the thing that they need to the way you report vulnerabilities is like, what is it, Tyrone? Some kind of a website or something that they're going to put on NISA. When is it going to be available? They keep talking about September. Like, how do you do that right before the deadline? The insanity of how this group operates and their inability to actually execute is mind-numbing. It's
I mean, I put a link in the chat, a couple of links. One is to the latest guidance, which is, for example, tries to explain this concept of where your product does things that fit into multiple categories. You're supposed to select the core functionality of the product. My interpretation, again, this is only personal, is, for example, Josh was mentioning Oracle Linux, which also has virtualization, but the operating system is the main core functionality. So that's what we would evaluate against. Now, the danger of this I learned during the conference is, okay, so you can choose to evaluate against the core product, but your customer is effectively going to have to do a risk analysis of whatever part of your product they're using. So if you don't keep that in your virtualization in scope, they've got nothing to work with. And there's no way they can do the evaluation themselves if they're having to think about doing it to a class 2 level. And by the way, for those that think they got products that are going to end up in class 2, please do look at the vertical standards that are being drafted. They look horrendous.
I wanted to talk about that. Yeah. So,
but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So I mentioned the horizontal standards and I gave the example of the vulnerability. Think of each of these guys, the higher level things, security monitoring, facilities protection, operational safety, as being the vertical standards. Think if the way I would think about in the common criteria is like a supersized protection profile, but they are not collaboratively developed. Vendors, I don't think, were much involved. And in many cases, some of us will not be able to comply. It's a huge problem. So if you're doing class 2 and you got to use those vertical standards, I don't know what they're going to do about that. I really don't, because what if nobody can comply? All right. If those of you who remember the CCUF in Washington, D.C., when the draft EUCC came out and certain schemes were extremely upset that it was made available, much worse here because they actually did make them law. So there you go. Cryptography is another horizontal standard, which is interesting because they basically say must use something like generally accepted cryptography, which is completely crazy because, I don't know, TLS 1.0 could be a generally accepted cryptography. It's deprecated, but it's generally accepted cryptography. It's really funny how things that are actually really important got de-emphasized, probably because they can't politically agree on what's acceptable crypto. What they said is, oh yeah, confidentiality, data in transit and storage, data integrity, that's what they want to see for crypto. They call it state-of-the-art crypto. Agreed crypto mechanisms, that's what you'll see. Sorry, that's the word. ACM. Oh, by the way, ACM, yeah, I have a note. Slide 15 of some presentation, it had acceptable algorithms and ciphers. If the slides are available yet, we could pull those down. That presentation was called CRA Crypto Requirements by Markus Saarinen. Really good presentation. Saarinen. Yeah. I was on a panel at the end of the conference. I had a lot of fun with that. I would have had even more fun if I knew to have been laid off. But so I kept my sort of Oracle hat on and didn't really channel Marianne, could have otherwise. But there was a point where one of the other panelists was talking about how good this is. And it was like the glasses half full kind of view on it. And I said, we need to talk about the other side of it. I said, what's the worst case scenario here? And the other panelists just looked at me like, and I said, the worst case scenario is empty shelf. What does empty shelf mean? It means that vendors may decide the risk is not worth it, and they will not sell technology at all in the EU if there's any risk of being hit with these crazy penalties. It's insanity. It is a little bit of a tech, and I wouldn't call it protectionism, because I think obviously the EU vendors are subject to the same thing. Yeah. You could also argue, I don't know if there's any labs. I guess there are labs on the phone. Michael's here. This is a tremendous opportunity for the labs and consultants to make money, because the vertical standards and the horizontal standards topped onto CC. Wow. Now, here's the problem. There are not enough qualified evaluators and consultants in the world to do the amount of work that's needed to meet all this. And that's just assuming the greens, blues, and reds. Never mind, it is, in my mind, a barrier to trade for small companies to even do the default category and do it, because here's the thing. When you do a declaration of conformity and then the customer finds out you don't conform, you could still be subject to those penalties. Doing a self-assessment in some ways is worse, because you don't even have a third-party lab.
So you have this module B, module C way of getting your conformance, to demonstrate your conformance. And the other way is module H, which is the assessment of your quality assurance system or quality management system. And for EUCC to be able to be used, my understanding is it would require a delegated act from the Commission or from the EU to be even able to use that approach. So this is not the standard. So using EUCC is not the standard approach to demonstrate that conformance. The standard approach would be this module B, C, and module H.
I think you're right, Michael. It's not tested. I think vendors are hoping we'll be able to use existing CC certificates or EUCC, NIAP, CCRA, and then just do top-ups. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is our CC certificates aren't worth the paper they're printed on in Europe, and you got to do all this other stuff completely separately. You're right. That is the worst case.
But if you do, for example, module H, you do the assessment. I'm not sure how this will work, because for each of those modules, you will probably need different accreditations. So it's not, I think, not completely decided yet at this stage what you need as a conformity assessment body. But it looks like for the module B, you will probably need ISO 17065 accreditation and 17021/1 for the module H thing. So even for the type of assessment, each lab needs to have different accreditations. I want to note so this is not like printing money. As you said, on the one hand, we will not have enough resources, but on the other hand, the expected effort to undergo these assessments is probably pretty different. So some of these approaches will probably involve much less efforts in total than others.
Agreed. It totally depends. Yeah, I agree, Michael. There's so many unknowns. Tammy asked, does the third-party lab assume some responsibility in the declaration of acceptability? It's conformity. What if something is found later? Good question. I asked every lab I met with, are they going to sign something that says if later on there's a gap found, are they going to take liability? And every one of the labs said not interested in doing that. So they would not allow that in a statement of work or a contract with a vendor. I don't know if they're planning. I don't think that they've put any kind of infrastructure in to create liability protections for labs. If any lab were to sign on with a vendor to do an evaluation and say, yep, if we give you a declaration of conformity and something's found later, we will pay the fine, they will get a lot of business, because vendors will be happy to sign on with a lab that agrees to do that. Yeah. So to me, this thing changes our world. This little world that we live in was going to change my world at Oracle, but they're going in a different direction. I really can't comment on what their plan is going to be. But as far as the rest of you guys are concerned, if you want to continue to sell in the EU, you got to start working on this. And this conference is way more important than any of the other ones we go to, because all the decision makers are there. And everybody who was, a lot of the people who are involved in creating all these standards, the ETSI standards, the Senelec, it's a whole new ball game here that they're creating, and the clock is ticking big time, especially on the vulnerability bit. I'll take a couple more questions, but
there is a technical guideline, a draft for a technical guideline by BSI, how to reuse your existing ISO 27001 certification for module H, just that you're aware of. So, because it's a no-brainer, right? You have some certifications already in the quality assurance domain. Can I utilize that? And BSI has issued a technical guidelines, how you could achieve that. And maybe I will provide the link if I find it.
okay, thank you, Michael. That's great. I think we need a whole section on the CCUF about the CRA. And I think that the CRA and its impact on CC evaluations, FIPS validations, all the work that people do, Nessus evaluations, there ought to be a technical working group formed ASAP to figure out how to address this. The only way we're going to be able to survive as a group and not be completely, utterly buried is to work together like we've done to address all these other things. That's my recommendation.
I see we have one more question.
Yeah,
Last
Mary,
one.
go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Josh. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for your presentation.
Yep.
As you mentioned a few minutes ago, we have the lack of expertise and consultancy services in this area. I wanted just to know, in your opinion, in which area we need to develop the expertise and consultancy services based on the recent experience as you presented here. Thank you so much.
What's needed probably is very similar kind of skill sets for common criteria evaluations. People who can look at a claim, a security claim, and review evidence and determine compliance. They're not interested in functional testing like NIAP PPs. This is very focused on life cycle. This is a complete flip from the CCRA that was signed in 2014. SolarWinds, I think, impacted a lot of this, among many of the other vulnerabilities. Ransomware, all that stuff is not necessary. The functional testing that is done as a part of the NIAP PPs, in their minds, is not what's needed. So we need the kind of skill sets that the CCRA was trying to say is not useful anymore, which is smart evaluators who can make judgments and give thumbs up and thumbs down on security life cycle. That's what's needed in my mind. That's the hardest skill, and that's the most senior skill, most expensive skill. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll add one more thing. We need people to work on these vertical standards. They are a disaster for people who know about network devices. They get involved in that area. People who know about the protection of communications vertical standard. People who know about IAM need to work on access control, etc.